It began, as many things in Oxford do, with light. Not the brash light of summer, but that sallow, tentative gleam that creeps across the quads on an early March morning, dissolving the mist reluctantly, as though ashamed of its own intrusion. I remember standing by the window of my office, and the one that looks over St. Giles, and thinking that the city seemed almost translucent that day, its old stones hollowed out by years of rain and regret. Lewis had been speaking for several minutes before I realized I hadn't been listening. Something about a lecture gone wrong, a complaint from the college porter. The words drifted in and out, as sound does when the mind has decided to think elsewhere. He noticed, of course. He always did. "You're not with me, sir," he said, or something like it. I murmured that I was. I wasn't. A note lay on the desk, unopened. Pale paper, folded twice. The kind of stationery people used when correspondence still mattered. No sender's name. Just my own, written in an unfamiliar, spidery hand, as if the ink itself were nervous. I'd found it tucked beneath the windscreen wiper of the Jag earlier that morning, after leaving the Randolph. I'd been in the bar too late and for too long. I could tell because the barman had stopped polishing the glasses and started watching me. I opened the note, a single line, "There is something wrong with the light in Radcliffe Square." Lewis frowned when I showed it to him. He asked whether I thought it was a prank. Perhaps. But there was something about the phrasing that caught me a quiet oddness. Not in Radcliffe Square as in a lamppost or a fuse, but with the light itself, the kind of remark that belongs in philosophy tutorials or madhouses. I told Lewis we were going for a walk. He looked displeased. He never liked beginning a case without one, but there was no case, at least not yet, just a phrase that had the texture of mystery. We crossed Broad Street as the bells began to ring from St. Mary's, that weary, slow toll that always seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The square was deserted except for a man leaning on the railings by the camera, smoking. I thought for a moment he might speak to us, but he didn't. The light, indeed, was strange. The fog had thinned but not lifted, and the air shimmered faintly as if sunlight and shadow were out of step with one another. The stone of the Bodleian appeared almost fluid, its edges softened, untrustworthy. Even Lewis remarked that the place looked different. I noticed something then, small but insistent. The lamp above the northern archway flickered once every 12 seconds, precisely 12. Not the irregular pulse of a failing bulb, but an exact rhythm, the sort of thing that might be dismissed by most, but not by anyone with a fondness for codes. When I asked the porter, he said he had been doing that for days. Nobody had bothered to fix it. Budget cuts, apparently. I asked who was responsible for the lighting. The porter hesitated. "The city council," he said eventually. Or maybe the college. It was never quite clear. As we walked away, I looked back and saw the man who had been smoking had vanished, leaving the cigarette smouldering on the stones. I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that Oxford attracts ghosts long before it buries them. Later that evening, in my flat on North Parade, I examined the note again under the lamp. The handwriting trembled slightly on the downward strokes, as though written by someone elderly or unwell. I compared it against a few old case files, half out of curiosity, half out of habit. No match. But the inkit had a faint luminescence under the light, a quality I couldn't quite name. I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. Outside, the street was silent, except for the distant hum of bicycles and the occasional flutter of paper caught in the wind. I thought of the light again, the one that flickered in 12-second intervals, and wondered what it might be counting. Time, steps, a warning. When you've spent enough years among the dying, you learn that most things in life announce their endings quietly. A heartbeat that falters, a friendship that fades, a bulb that blinks at the edge of darkness. And so before I went to bed, I wrote the line in my notebook, the first entry of what would become, though I didn't yet know it, one of the most perplexing cases of my career. There is something wrong with the light in Radcliffe Square. It was the following morning when the business of the light began to entwine itself with the business of the living. The college porter at St. Swithin's had telephoned Lewis before breakfast. There had been a death in one of the staircases, a don, apparently, and, though it looked straightforward enough a fall, a head injury, there was, as the porter delicately put it, an air of disturbance about it. Lewis relayed the message over toast and marmalade as if reading from an obituary column. The name meant something to me. Dr. Francis Leland, Fellow in Philosophy, a man whose lectures I had once attended years earlier, before the police and I became reluctantly acquainted. I remembered a tall, angular man with an affection for paradox and a distaste for small talk. He had once remarked, in that dry, exact way of his, that most people didn't think they merely rearranged their prejudices. I liked him for that. The room where they had found him was on the second floor, overlooking the Fellows' garden. The curtains were drawn, though the morning outside was dazzling. A chair lay overturned, and the desk bore the scattered debris of a late-night tutorial notes, essays, a glass of whiskey half drunk, and a small brass lamp that still glowed faintly despite the daylight. Lewis crouched by the hearth. He had the gift, if one could call it that, of treating every corpse as if it might still be persuaded to answer questions. He pointed to the rug, where a faint indentation of shoe marks led toward the door, then stopped. No struggle, no disorder, save for the lamp. I said quietly that the position of the lamp was wrong. He asked what I meant. I didn't answer at once. The light struck the room oddly, and I found myself watching the shadow of the lamp against the bookcase, its angle inconsistent with its base, as though it had been moved after the fact. The college doctor muttered about a heart attack, a weak pulse, a fall, the inevitable collision between intellect and mortality. Yet something in the room refused to conform to that narrative. Leland's fountain pen had rolled beneath the chair, its nib bent and useless. His spectacles, however, were still folded neatly beside the essay papers. People don't remove their glasses to die. Lewis asked whether we should speak to the students. There were 2 names on the tutorial register, a Miss Clara Denning and a Mr. Piers Talbot. I remembered Denning vaguely from an inquest the previous year, brilliant, difficult, the sort of young woman who burned rather than glowed. We found her in the quad, smoking with the detached air of someone who has decided to survive the day by pretending it belongs to someone else. She said she had left her essay in Leland's room the night before and slipped under the door. She hadn't seen him since the previous afternoon. There had been no argument, no hint of trouble. Her eyes, however, lingered too long on the word argument. Talbot was different, smooth, confident, a future barrister, already rehearsing the gestures of persuasion. He spoke warmly of his tutor, of their late discussions about ethics and logic, of his shock at the news. Yet when I asked whether Leland had seemed distracted recently, he hesitated just a fraction too long. Not distracted, he said, preoccupied with what he didn't know. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Leland had been marking a paper that annoyed him with a clumsy argument about perception and illusion. Something about light and reality. The coincidence wasn't lost on me. We left them to their cigarettes and their grief. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and unconvincing. I told Lewis that perhaps we should visit the college library. He looked surprised. "What for?" he asked. "To read," I said. The librarian remembered Leland well. He had requested several rare volumes on optics and medieval theology in the last fortnight, odd companions for a philosopher of logic. I leafed through the request slips, and one word repeated itself across them all: lux, light, the Latin root of illumination, both literal and moral. As we stepped back into the drizzle, I found myself thinking again of the lamp, and of its deliberate displacement. If Leland had fallen naturally, the lamp would have remained at the edge of the desk. It had been moved, not violently, but with intention perhaps to retrieve something or to conceal it. Lewis said I was overthinking it. I told him that was the only kind of thinking worth doing. That night, unable to sleep, I revisited my notes. The rhythm of that flickering light in Radcliffe Square, 12 seconds, intruding on my thoughts. A rhythm echoed in the 12 essays scattered across Leland's desk. One for each week of term. 12 arguments, 12 perspectives on truth and illusion. Somewhere between those intervals, I felt sure, was the moment where light turned to darkness. It was in the library that the shape of the thing began to reveal itself, not fully, not even clearly, but like handwriting bleeding through paper. Oxford libraries have a peculiar silence, not of absence but of expectation, and St. Swithin's was no exception. The smell of parchment, dust, and mild decay always struck me as a kind of theology in itself. The librarian, a narrow man with the air of one born among index cards, had set aside Leland's borrowed books in a small pile. I looked through them without touching Deluche, Optica Thesaurus, and a worn copy of Boethius. The edges were feathered with penciled notes, sharp and disciplined, except in one margin where a single word had been written not in Leland's precise hand, but in a bolder, slanting script error. It struck me because it wasn't correctional, it was accusatory. The word faced a passage describing the paradox of perception, how light can both reveal and distort depending on the observer's angle. The philosophy of sight reduced to the frailty of interpretation. Lewis hovered at my shoulder. He never quite belonged in libraries, his patience too short for the pace of dust. He asked what I was looking for. I said I wasn't sure yet, which was true. He sighed in the way that meant he would wait regardless. There's a rhythm to inquiry that's half instinct, half memory. I noticed that one of the request slips bore a faint smudge, a fingerprint in red ink. Not blood printer's residue. Leland must have been marking something else recently, perhaps student essays. I asked to see them. The librarian hesitated, citing confidentiality, but bureaucracy yielded to grief more easily than to logic, and within minutes the folder was in my hands. The essays were as varied as youth, pretentious, brilliant, lazy, and earnest. But one caught my eye, Miss Denning's, the title, The Ethics of Illumination. Her argument, though clumsily structured, showed an uncomfortable understanding of her tutor's obsessions. She had written that truth, when overexposed, becomes blindness. A metaphor, yes, but also a confession of sorts. At the bottom, in Leland's handwriting, a small note, "See me." Lewis asked whether it meant anything. I said it always does when someone dies before explaining themselves. Outside, the rain had hardened into sleet. The city looked blurred, as though the air itself were reconsidering its loyalties. We walked toward the quad, boots striking puddles that reflected the tower lights in fractured symmetry. I thought of that word, again, error. It had the quality of remorse. We found Miss Denning later that afternoon in the cloisters, reading. She said she had written the essay in haste, that Leland had been kind but exacting. She insisted there was nothing between them, though I had not asked. The denial was too swift, like a door slammed in a corridor no one else had entered. I asked if she knew who might have written in his books. She shrugged. Perhaps another student. Perhaps Leland himself trying out a different voice. It was possible. People often disguise their own doubts by giving them new handwriting. As we spoke, a small slip of paper fell from her notebook. She bent to retrieve it too quickly. I saw only a fragment of text before it vanished into her sleeve. The light lies. When she walked away, I told Lewis to let her be. I preferred the company of ghosts to liars, and Oxford is never short of either. That night I returned to the college alone. The porter had locked the staircase, but he gave me the key after I told him that truth sometimes sleeps where it shouldn't. In Leland's room, the air still held the scent of burnt dust from the lamp. On the desk lay an open volume of Boethius, its Latin half obscured by shadow. I turned it slightly, and there, in the margin of the final page, someone had written in the same hand as before, Lux mentitur. Light lies. It wasn't evidence, not yet. Just the faint suggestion that Leland had discovered something perhaps about his students, perhaps about himself, that could no longer bear illumination. I closed the book carefully. There are moments when silence feels complicit, when even the walls seem to avert their gaze. And I thought, not for the first time, that every investigation begins not with curiosity, but with guilt, the quiet conviction that one has already missed what mattered most. The lecture hall was colder than I remembered. Those great spaces never quite shake the echo of what's been said inside them, half-buried syllables of brilliance and boredom, drifting in the rafters long after the lights go out. I stood at the back, watching a woman gather papers from the lectern. Her movements were neat but deliberate, the kind of care people take when their thoughts are elsewhere. Her name, according to the porter, was Dr. Evelyn Carrow. A visiting scholar from Edinburgh, specialist in medieval illumination, the art of painting with gold on darkness. I thought the irony was too precise to be accidental. She had been working with Leland, or near him, for the past few months. I waited until she noticed me, and when she did, she smiled with the kind of composure that only guilt or detachment can produce. She said she had heard about Leland's death, and that it was dreadful, though she had not known him well. I told her I doubted that. She hesitated, and the smile faltered for just long enough. The pause was her first confession. She asked whether I believed it was an accident. I said I believed very little these days. She nodded as though that were an answer. I noticed then the faint shimmer of gold dust on her cuffs, residue from her work, perhaps, or something older. The walls behind her were lined with portraits, the painted faces of men who had once thought themselves immortal. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. She gathered her notes with brisk efficiency, speaking of manuscripts, pigment and faith. How medieval monks believed light was not mere brightness, but revelation, divine presence made visible. She said it was possible to mistake radiance for truth. I asked whether that was her experience or Leland's. She looked away. There was a moment of silence, the kind that fills rather than empties a room. I could hear the faint scrape of her fountain pen against the wood. I told her that I had seen the word error written in Leland's margin. Her hand froze mid-motion. Then she said softly that it was hers. She had borrowed his book, made notes, and returned it. Nothing sinister. But the word, she said, referred to herself. She had misread a passage and corrected it later. She didn't look convinced. I asked when she had last seen him. She said 2 nights before his death, at dinner in the hall. He had been distracted, unwell perhaps, talking about the nature of illusion, how every truth required a corresponding lie to sustain it. I asked if they had argued. She said scholars don't argue, they refine one another. It sounded rehearsed. As she spoke, I noticed the angle of light through the stained glass above the dais. The colours slid across her face, shifting from red to violet, fragmenting her expression into facets. For a moment, she looked like a mosaic, something sacred and broken in the same breath. Lewis, who had arrived late, whispered that there was someone else in the corridor. A student, perhaps, eavesdropping. But when he opened the door, the passage was empty except for a single chair slightly out of place, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. I turned back to Dr. Carrow. She was packing the last of her papers, but one sheet had fallen to the floor near my feet. It was a photocopy of a manuscript leaf and illumination of a hand emerging from darkness, holding a small golden lamp. Beneath it, in Latin, a line I recognized from Boethius' Lux Mentitur, "Light lies." She said it was one of Leland's favorite quotations, that he used it as an epigraph for his lectures. I told her it was curious, since it had appeared in his handwriting only after his death. That was when she stopped breathing, for half a second too long. Outside, the bells began to ring again, the hour indistinct, as if time itself were unwilling to be counted. I watched her walk away down the corridor, her figure dimming into shadow, until only the trace of that faint gold shimmer remained. Lewis said she seemed the nervous type. I told him nerves were a form of honesty. Only the calm ones ever truly worry me. We stepped out into the quad, the air heavy with drizzle and the scent of wet stone. I found myself glancing up at the windows of the lecture hall. The lamps within flickered once, then steadied. The rhythm, I thought, was almost familiar. 12 seconds again. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. But as we walked back toward the gate, I caught the faint reflection of that golden dust still on my sleeve. A fragment of her world that had followed me into mine, whispering of something that shimmered too brightly to be innocent. It was Lewis who suggested we speak again with Piers Talbot. He said the boy had seemed too polished for grief. I agreed. The young, when lying, often mistake composure for credibility. By afternoon, the air had soured into that peculiar stillness that precedes rain. The college gardens were slick with dew, the paving stones reflecting an anemic sun. We found Talbot seated beneath the cloister, a book open on his knees, unread. He greeted us as though we were acquaintances rather than intrusions. His tie was perfect, his tone careful. I have always distrusted tidy men. They conceal the untidy truths of their minds too well. He asked if there was progress in the inquiry. I said progress was a word best avoided in police work. It implied purpose. He smiled, the kind of smile that seeks to establish equality between hunter and quarry. He said Leland had been unwell, that everyone had noticed the fatigue, the short temper, the erratic hours. He spoke as one might speak of a tutor after final fondness tempered by relief. I asked when he last saw him. The night before the accident, he said. A tutorial. They had discussed Miss Denning's essay. That name again. It hovered like the faint scent of smoke in a room long after the fire had gone. I asked what about the essay had interested Leland so deeply. He hesitated, glancing toward the quadrangle. He said it wasn't the argument, it was the handwriting. Leland had remarked on it. It had changed, he said, more slanted, less precise. I asked how he knew that. Talbot shrugged. He'd seen her earlier work. She'd shown it to him, apparently, seeking feedback. Students rarely invite rivals to proofread. I asked if they were close. He said they were colleagues. His pause made the word sound anatomical. Lewis asked about the lamp in Leland's room. Talbot frowned as though the question were beneath him. He hadn't noticed anything unusual. I reminded him that most truths hide behind the unnoticed. He smiled again, thinner this time. Then, quite suddenly, He asked whether we believed in coincidence. I said I believed in timing, which is far crueler. He rose, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers, and I saw that his pupils, his literal pupils, were constricted despite the dim light. A pharmacological tell, perhaps, anxiety or something stronger. He said he'd heard Leland had been investigating a medieval text, something to do with mirrors and perception, that Dr. Caro had helped him translate it. He mentioned this too casually, like someone placing a card in the middle of a game and pretending not to watch the reaction. After he left, Lewis muttered that the lad was clever but slippery. I told him cleverness was never the problem, clarity was. The two are rarely found together. We walked across the quad toward the porter's lodge. The chapel bells struck 4, each note diffused by the damp air. In the window above the hall, I saw Miss Denning pass by, a pale shape behind the glass. She paused, as if sensing she was being watched, then turned away. The shadow of her movement lingered, delicate and deliberate. I spent the evening in my office, tracing connections like threads across a map only I could see. Denning's essay, the flickering lamp, the Latin phrase, light lies. The coincidence with Leland's research on illumination was too precise to dismiss. Perhaps it wasn't the light that lied, but the eyes that received it. The pupil, after all, means both student and aperture. It is the opening through which knowledge or deception enters. I poured a whiskey and stared at the crossword on my desk. One clue caught me. Deceiver of sight, 5 letters. I filled it in without hesitation. Mirror. Sometimes deduction comes not from logic, but from language. The words choose you, not the other way round. At midnight, a knock came at the door. It was the porter, cap in hand, uneasy. He said a student had been seen at the Radcliffe Square again, near the lamp that flickered. A woman, possibly Miss Denning. She'd left quickly when approached. I told him to lock the gates. He asked whether she was in danger. I said everyone was, though few realized it in time. When he left, I sat there for a long while, the silence pressing close. I thought of the light, counting its intervals. 12 seconds, 12 essays, 12 hours since Leland's death, a symmetry that felt designed, not accidental. I wrote a single line in my notebook before turning out the lamp. The pupil reflects before it sees. Even now, I'm not sure whether I meant her or myself. The morning began with a crossword and a confession, though only one of them was written. I had opened the Times as ritual, not pleasure, each clue another small exercise in control. It's the only form of faith I still possess, that there is always a hidden pattern waiting to be seen. Yet that morning, the clues refused to yield. Across 23 down, the word that emerged, illumination, felt almost insolent, as though the paper itself were mocking me. Lewis arrived with coffee that had already surrendered its warmth. He said Miss Denning had come forward. She wanted to talk. He sounded almost relieved, as if confession could tidy what conscience could not. I told him that guilt and truth were rarely synonyms. We met her in one of the smaller tutorial rooms overlooking the quad. The place had that stale scent of old chalk and nervous students. She sat near the window, her hands clasped, her posture too straight to be natural. When I entered, she looked at me as though the act itself were incriminating. She said she had lied before. She had in fact seen Leland the night he died. He had summoned her, something about her essay. He had been agitated, pacing the room, speaking of perception and faith, how light might deceive. She said she had never seen him like that. He told her there was danger in confusing intellect with morality, that truth was not a virtue, but a temptation. Then he asked whether she believed in redemption. She said she didn't. I believed her. She paused, looking down at her hands. There was a faint mark along her right palm, like a healed burn. She noticed me and turned it away. She said she had left him alive, that the lamp was still burning when she closed the door. Lewis asked why she hadn't said any of this before. Fear, she said simply, but fear of what or whom she didn't clarify. I asked about Piers Talbot. She smiled faintly at the name. Brilliant, she said, but unkind. He wanted everything illuminated, every motive stripped of mystery. He thought the world should explain itself. I asked if she admired that. She said she pitied it. There was something almost priestly in the way she spoke each sentence, half confession, half prayer. I asked about the Latin note lux mentita. Her eyes flickered just once. She said it was a phrase Leland used often in tutorials. The light lies, he'd tell them, because people prefer to see what flatters them. She said he had written it once on the blackboard and left it there for weeks. Perhaps it had been his creed, or his curse. When she left, Lewis asked what I made of her story. I said it was either too careful or too true. The distinction in Oxford is seldom visible. I returned to my room that evening and found the crossword still unfinished. The unfilled spaces felt suddenly personal, the clues more accusatory than inviting. I poured a whiskey and stared at the grid. 7 down a word that means both faith and deception. 5, I filled it in slowly. A small deduction perhaps, but it lingered. At 9, the telephone rang, the porter from St. Swithin's. He sounded uncertain, almost embarrassed. He said someone had been in Leland's room again. Nothing taken, but the lamp had been turned on, the same lamp that had burned the night of his death. I went alone. The air smelled of polish and damp carpet. The lamp cast its pale circle across the desk, illuminating a single open notebook. It wasn't Leland's hand, but a younger one, slanted, impatient. Across the first page, a sentence written twice over, as if rehearsed, truth must be seen to be believed. The second line had been crossed out and replaced with truth must be believed to be seen. Lewis arrived a few minutes later. He asked what it meant. I told him it depended on who had written it and when. He said he'd check the fingerprints. I said not to bother. Some answers are best left smudged. Back in my flat, I folded the newspaper and lit a cigarette. The smoke coiled upward, tracing invisible letters against the ceiling. I thought of Leland, of Miss Denning, of the young man with constricted pupils and perfect grammar. And I thought, not for the first time, how the line between confession and strategy is often a matter of who's listening. The crossword still lay open beside me, one clue unsolved. Seeker of light, easily blinded 6. I wrote the word, without hesitation, mortal. There are silences in Oxford that don't belong to peace. The Bodleian after dusk is one of them. The air thickens as if the centuries are exhaling in unison, and the sound of your own breathing feels like trespass. I had gone there because I couldn't sleep, and because sleeplessness in my line of work is just another method of thinking. The librarian on duty was a young woman I didn't recognize earnestly, apologetic, the kind who still believed silence was civility. She led me to the reading room where Leland had last signed the visitor's register. A Thursday evening, 2 days before his death. The entry beneath his name read E. Carow, the one after P. Talbot. Neatly aligned, as if chance had learned the art of composition. I sat at his usual desk. A faint circular mark lingered there, whiskey perhaps, or the base of that same brass lamp he seemed unable to live without. I switched it on. The light was too white, too modern. I wondered what had drawn him here on that particular night. Books, perhaps, or something less visible. On the table lay a loose sheet of paper half tucked beneath an atlas, Not a note, exactly, more a fragment of an index card, a quotation in Latin, clara lux, obscura mens. Bright light, dark mind. The handwriting was not Leland's. It leaned rightward, impatient, familiar. I slipped it into my pocket without comment. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, still smelling faintly of rain and tobacco. He said the pathologist's report was inconclusive. Cause of death, head trauma consistent with a fall. No defensive wounds, no sign of another in the room. A simple accident, if one were inclined toward simplicity. I told him Oxford rarely obliged. He followed my gaze toward the far shelves. The manuscripts there were old enough to remember belief. Gilded pages, edges frayed by reverence. I traced one spine with my finger speculum animi, The Mirror of the Soul. The title felt too apt. I asked the librarian to fetch it for me. She hesitated, said it was restricted. I said the truth usually is. When she returned, I opened it carefully. A treatise on reflection, both optical and moral. In the margins, a series of notations written in pencil in different hands, modern. Each annotation corresponded to a passage about mirrors as vessels of light. But one, near the end, stopped me. Wherever light fails, the self divides. Lewis said it didn't sound like theology. I said it sounded like a confession. The librarian lingered nearby, curious but discreet. She asked whether we were close to solving the mystery. I told her there was no mystery, only people, and they were far less solvable. She smiled uncertainly and withdrew. When she'd gone, I took out the index fragment again. The ink smudged slightly under the lamplight. Leland had once told me, years ago, when we were both younger and still pretended to enjoy conversation, that meaning hides in proximity, not intention. The closeness of names, the echo of words, Caro, Talbot, Leland. The sequence on the register wasn't mere coincidence, it was choreography. I asked Lewis whether he recalled seeing gold dust in Leland's room. He shook his head. He remembered books, papers, whiskey, but not dust. I told him Dr. Caro's sleeve bore traces of it. He shrugged, unimpressed. Artists make messes, he said. I told him philosophers do too, only quieter. We left the library close to midnight. The rain had ceased, leaving the city slick and shining. The lamps along Broad Street flickered faintly, the same 12-second rhythm that had haunted the square since the beginning. I watched their slow, deliberate pulse and wondered whether Leland had timed his final steps to that beat. Lewis said he didn't like the feeling of the place. Too empty, he said. I told him emptiness was never a condition, only a consequence. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and spread the evidence across my desk. The index card, the quotation, the register. The pattern was beginning to reveal itself not as a straight line, but as light refracted through glass. The crossword from earlier that week still lay open, one clue unfinished, quiet revelation. Key 6, the answer, arrived without effort secret. I wrote it in, then turned out the lamp. The darkness that followed was almost a comfort. After all, I thought, light tells you what's there. But only darkness tells you what's missing. It was a Wednesday evening when I returned to the scene of Leland's death. The staircase had been locked since the investigation began, but the porter, after a few muttered protests about regulations, handed me the key. There is always a certain ritual to revisiting the place where something ends. One walks slower, listens harder, half expecting the air itself to confess. The corridor smelled faintly of furniture polish and chalk dust, the scent of academic tidiness. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the silence adjust to me. The room was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps grief had expanded it in my mind. The brass lamp still sat on the desk, burnished now by routine cleaning. I switched it on. Its light was steady, but the shadow it cast was oddly doubled, as if the bulb refracted through glass. Lewis arrived 10 minutes later, slightly out of breath. He carried a small envelope, photographs from the coroner's report, copies of the floor plan. He asked what I expected to find. I told him expectation was the enemy of truth. We stood side by side, two men watching the past replay itself in silence. I asked him to close the curtains. The effect was immediate. The room shrank into a narrow pool of light, a miniature stage. I moved to the chair, adjusting its position, its angle, its fall. The wound had been to the right temple, the descent backward, the glass of whiskey shattered mid-air. But the pattern of the spatter on the far wall had never matched. It reached too high, as if the motion had begun before the fall, not during it. Lewis asked whether I thought someone had pushed him. I said that was the simplest answer. Simplicity, however, was a stranger to Oxford. I crouched near the desk, beneath it a faint scrape along the wood, fresh, deliberate. I ran my finger along the groove, metal, thin as a blade. A drawer had once held something sharp, a letter opener perhaps. It was missing now. I told Lewis to bring the photographs closer. In one of them, Leland's right hand rested palm down beside the chair. His fingers were spread. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, but something about the alignment was wrong. The forefinger extended too far, as if reaching for something that was no longer there. A reflex of thought, not an accident. The whiskey glass had fallen toward the rug, not away from it. Gravity doesn't lie, but people do. I stood, poured myself a measure from the decanter, still left on the shelf. The liquid caught the lamplight in thin gold ribbons. I raised the glass slightly, measuring the reflection in the mirror across the room. From where he'd sat, Leland would have seen his own reflection perfectly, himself and the lamp, side by side. Lewis said I was chasing ghosts. I told him ghosts were the only witnesses who didn't contradict themselves. He left to fetch something from the car. When the door closed, the room seemed to breathe again. I looked at the desk, the essays, the notebooks, the one empty envelope addressed, but never sealed. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Dr. Evelyn Carrow. There was a letter inside, unfinished. The ink had faded slightly, the last line breaking mid-word. You were right about nothing more. Outside, the first drops of rain began against the window, soft and spaced, like the opening notes of a requiem. I sat in Leland's chair, the lamp's pulse steady above me. I turned the switch once, and then again. 12 seconds. The same rhythm as the lamp in Radcliffe Square. It wasn't a coincidence. It was control. Someone had timed it. Someone had mirrored it. Lewis returned, muttering about the weather. I asked him to turn off the light. When he did, the reflection in the window became clear. Two silhouettes, the living and the dead, superimposed for a heartbeat, then darkness. I told him that light had been Leland's undoing. He misunderstood it. He sought purity where there was only prism. Lewis frowned, saying he didn't follow. I told him I wasn't sure I did either. Before we left, I switched the lamp back on and set the chair upright again. A gesture of courtesy to the dead, perhaps? Or guilt? As we stepped into the stairwell, the corridor seemed longer, the air heavier. Lewis asked what I'd learned. I said only this, that every reconstruction is an act of imagination, and imagination, like light, has a habit of lying. I locked the door behind us, pocketed the key, and thought not for the first time that truth rarely lives in the scene of the crime. It hides, instead, in the spaces where silence hums and the dust still remembers the fall. I have often thought that deception in Oxford wears the quietest shoes. It doesn't stride, It glides between staircases and syllogisms, behind oak-panelled doors where ideas are mistaken for integrity. That morning, the porter had called to say a student was holding tutorials that didn't exist. The phrase itself was absurd. Tutorials are the blood of the place, but the tone of his voice suggested something colder. Lewis met me by the cloister, his coat collar turned up against a drizzle so thin it was almost smoke. He said the student in question was Piers Talbot, that he'd been using Leland's name to arrange private meetings after the man's death. I remember feeling neither shock nor anger, just that slow, inevitable click that accompanies the fitting of one piece in a puzzle you wish you hadn't begun. We found him in a lecture room at the far end of the quad. The air smelled of wet wool and chalk. He was sitting at the desk, the same desk where Leland had once lectured, a notebook open before him. Miss Denning sat opposite, pale, defensive, her hand poised as though ready to write or flee. The lamplight curved around them like a confessional. He said they were discussing her future and that he had offered to help with postgraduate applications. She stared at the floor. Lewis asked why he hadn't gone through proper channels. Talbot smiled in that effortless way that made everything sound plausible. He said formality was the enemy of intellect. I said deceit was worse. There was a flicker, then just the smallest tremor in his composure, like light faltering on still water. He asked whether I was accusing him of something. I told him I was never accused, I observed. His eyes darkened. The silence that followed was long enough for guilt to learn how to breathe. Miss Denning spoke at last, her voice brittle. She said he'd been pressing her to retrieve Leland's papers, that he claimed there was an unfinished manuscript worth money. She hadn't believed him. He interrupted too quickly to say she was mistaken. Lewis looked at me, and I could almost hear the thought forming between us lies, never arriving alone. I asked whether he knew of the phrase lux mentitur. He blinked, as if caught in sudden light. He said Leland used it often, that it amused him. I asked whether he understood it. He said it meant the light deceives. I told him it meant something more than the light lies, because it tells too much. He didn't reply. On the desk lay a folder, one of Leland's, stamped with the college crest. Inside were photocopies of old correspondence, half legible, annotated in two hands. One belonged to Leland. The other I recognized from the fragment in the library. Evelyn Carrow. Lewis said quietly that this was beginning to look like theft. I said theft was the least of it. What mattered was the order of things, who borrowed from whom, who annotated first. I turned one of the pages over, and the deduction came not from logic, but from handwriting. The ink on Carrow's notes had bled into Leland's margin, not the reverse. She had written last. Her commentary wasn't academic, it was a correction. I closed the folder and handed it back to Talbot. He didn't move to take it. His hand remained flat on the table, knuckles taut. I asked whether he had ever been Leland's pupil, or merely his shadow. His jaw tightened. Miss Denning rose abruptly, saying she wanted to leave. Talbot didn't stop her. He only watched as she passed through the doorway, her reflection vanishing from the glass like a ghost deciding against reappearance. When she was gone, he said something low, almost tender. That genius deserved continuity, that Leland's ideas shouldn't die with him. He said he'd been chosen to finish what had been started. I asked who had chosen him. He smiled faintly. The dead, he said. Outside, the bells of St. Mary began to ring again, slowly, unevenly, as if uncertain of the hour. I told Lewis to follow Miss Denning to make sure she went home. I stayed behind, staring at the lamp's reflection on the desk. It pulsed faintly, 12 seconds apart. I could hear rain on the windows, soft, persistent, like someone insisting on an entry long denied. Before leaving, I looked once more at the folder. One page had fallen out. On it, a single line written in Leland's unmistakable hand: "Knowledge without mercy is a kind of blindness." The ink had smudged beneath the weight of another palm. I could not tell whose. I left the room in darkness. Some truths, I thought, do not need light. They only need time. It is a strange thing, the anatomy of a lie. It begins not with the tongue, but with silence, the small pause before the untruth chooses its shape. In Oxford, where conversation often masquerades as revelation, such pauses are plentiful. That night I found myself tracing one of them through the cold corridors of St. Swithin's, where the echoes of Leland's last words seemed to persist, though he had none left to give. Lewis had gone home, claiming exhaustion. I stayed. I told him it was because I wanted to think, though that was never the whole truth. Thinking in solitude has never been thought of as penance, disguised as logic. The rain was fine and deliberate, misting the quad in silver. I could see the reflection of the lamp in the puddles, pulsing its 12-second rhythm as if the city itself were counting. Somewhere a bell struck 10:30. In the rooms above, a light flickered, then steadied. Miss Denning's window. I watched it for a while before deciding that I had delayed the inevitable long enough. She opened the door without surprise, as if she had been expecting me. The room was immaculate, too immaculate for a student. Books stacked by colour, papers arranged in a symmetry that suggested control rather than tidiness. A small brass clock ticked too loudly. She offered tea and I declined. I told her about Talbot's claim, about the false tutorials, the manuscript, the annotations. She said she had known nothing about them. Her hands were folded, but the fingertips pressed too tightly together, whitening at the edges. I told her Leland's death was not accidental, that someone had been with him when he fell. She did not ask who, only why I thought so. Because of the light, I said. It was a deduction so small it hardly deserved the name. Yet it carried the weight of everything that had come before. The lamp's reflection on the window of Leland's study had been wrong, the angle impossible unless the curtains were open. But the porter had sworn they were drawn when he found the body. Someone had closed them after the fall. Someone who didn't wish to be seen leaving. She stared at me for a long time and then said softly that the truth is never what it looks like under the first light. The words might have been Leland's or her own. She said he had asked her to meet him that night, that he'd been afraid. Not of scandal or exposure, but of an idea that his work had revealed something he could no longer believe. He'd spoken of sight and sin as if they were twins. Her voice was calm, almost detached, but her eyes kept drifting toward the desk. A notebook lay open there. I asked whether it was his. She said no. I asked whether I might look. She hesitated, then nodded. It was filled with fragments, phrases, diagrams, the language of obsession. One line stood out. The truest reflection is the one that lies back. Beneath it, a sketch of a lampas lamp with a faint circle drawn around it, 12 marks at equal intervals, like the face of a clock. I closed the notebook. I told her that Leland had discovered something, and someone had feared what he might do with it. She asked if I meant Talbot. I said I didn't know. She said she did. Her tone was not confident, merely resigned. She told me Talbot had visited her that evening, that he had confessed to forging some of Leland's annotations, selling copies to collectors. He said it was harmless, academic vanity with a price tag. But then Leland found out. He'd threatened to report him. I asked whether she believed Talbot capable of murder. She said she didn't know what anyone was capable of until they were cornered. Then after a pause he said, "Light reveals everything, but sometimes you have to shade it, or it blinds you." I left her there, sitting by the brass clock, its tick now louder, slower, crueler. Outside the rain had stopped. The air was clear, sharp, almost surgical. I walked back through the quad and saw the lamplight reflected in the puddles again, only this time the rhythm was gone. Fixed. Someone had repaired it. Back in my room I poured the last of the whiskey. The crossword lay untouched, the page curled at the edges. One clue stared back at me, deceiver that shows the truth. 6. The answer came easily now. Mirror. I thought of Leland's lamp, the reflections, the 12 marks, the falsified notes, all the ways knowledge and deceit had folded into each other until they were indistinguishable. I wrote a single line in my own notebook before closing it. The anatomy of a lie is the study of what the truth refuses to say. Then I turned off the light, and the room at last stopped pretending to understand me. The case should have ended there. Most do on paper. Reports filed, statements signed, the world shuffled neatly back into its bureaucratic order. Yet I've never trusted endings that arrive too quietly. They have the scent of concealment, like pages glued together to disguise what was written between them. It was 2 nights after the inquest that I found the envelope. I hadn't gone looking for it. It had slipped under my door at the Randolph, anonymous, precise, folded once. The handwriting was careful, almost clerical. Inside, a single sheet, no greeting, no signature, just a line of text. You looked in the wrong light. I sat with it for a long time, the city murmuring beneath my window. Oxford after midnight is a kind of confession, half uttered, half withheld. I thought of Leland's lamp, the flicker, the reflection, the false tutorial, the word mirror. Every clue had led toward illumination, as if knowledge itself were the crime. Yet perhaps it had been the opposite all along. Perhaps the lie had hidden not in the light, but in its shadow. The next morning I went to St. Swithin's one last time. The porter nodded, his expression wary, as though he'd already forgotten who I was supposed to be. I crossed the quad slowly, rain stippling the cobblestones. The staircase door resisted my key, then yielded. Leland's rooms were exactly as before, order restored, chaos erased. But the air held that faint scent of oil and paper that lingers long after intellect has died. I opened the curtains. The light fell differently now, softer, unfocused. A thin beam cut across the desk, landing on a shelf of books I hadn't noticed before. Philosophy, theology, a smattering of poetry. One volume stood slightly askew. Boethius again. I pulled it free. The spine cracked faintly, the way age confesses unwillingly. A folded paper fell from between the pages. It was a letter, addressed but unsent, to Dr. Evelyn Carrow. I read it once, then again. It was not a love letter nor an accusation, but something between the two, a moral plea disguised as intellectual inquiry. He wrote of deception as a form of mercy, of the human need to be mistaken. He said that to see clearly was not wisdom, but cruelty. And at the bottom, a line added later, in another pen, "Tell them I was right." Lewis arrived as I stood by the window. He said the file was closed and that the college preferred discretion. He asked why I was still here. I told him the truth and had a habit of lingering longer than he lived. He didn't answer, but his eyes wandered to the lamp. He reached to switch it on. I stopped him. "Leave it," I said. "Some lights aren't meant to return." We left together, though he spoke little. Outside, the drizzle had turned to fog. The tower bells were muffled, the air heavy with unspoken conclusions. I asked whether he believed Talbot guilty. He said it didn't matter if the evidence was enough. I said, evidence is a mirror that shows what you expect to see. He said mirrors don't kill people. I told him they do, when they're believed. Later that evening, in my flat, I unfolded the anonymous note again. You looked in the wrong light. I placed it beside Leland's letter and saw, with a quiet inevitability, that the handwriting was the same. Evelyn Carrow's. I poured myself a whiskey. Outside, the street lamps flickered faintly, as though remembering the code I'd tried so hard to forget. 12 seconds, always 12. A pattern that had bound us all like a rhythm of conscience. I thought of her gold dust, her silence, her careful avoidance of certain truths. Perhaps she had loved him. Perhaps she had feared what his clarity might reveal of her own reflection. The glass was empty before I realized I'd lifted it. I wrote nothing in my notes that night. Some things belong to memory, not record. Before turning out the light, I looked once more at the letter, its ink trembling faintly in the lamplight. The last words are still legible, still defiant. Tell them I was right. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps rightness, like light, blinds more than it reveals. I closed the curtains, the room darkened. And for the first time in weeks I let it stay that way.